Whispers of the Dead Hills. Chapter 1. The Road Through the Spent Forest. The last ochre smear of daylight drained behind the ridgeline as Mark Taylor guided his battered Dodge pickup onto Old Ash Orchard Road, a forgotten vein of asphalt coiling through the Monongahela foothills east of Grafton Falls, West Virginia. A stagnant mist pressed against the windshield, clinging to the glass in greasy ribbons that the wipers only smeared wider, and the forest beyond seemed both starved and carnivorous. Black hickories scraped together overhead like arthritic limbs, and the dead leaves beneath them exhaled a sour, fungal breath that seeped through the vents. Each mile pulled him farther from cell service, and farther from the certainty that the road would still exist around the next blind curve. A sagging mile marker flashed in the headlights. 12 miles to Marrow's Gap, a mining settlement stricken from modern maps after the coal seam burned underground for 20 years. The paint on the sign blistered and peeled as if singed from within. Mark felt a pulse of unease rush his heartbeat faster. Still, he pressed on. The pavement narrowed without warning, edges broken away into trenches of dark mud. When he steered to miss a fallen limb, the truck's tires rolled over something softer than wood. Maybe a dead fawn. Maybe only waterlogged brush. But the jolt came with a wet cracking sound that made his stomach drop. Temperature inside the cab plunged as the mist thickened into a freezing drizzle. The radio, silent for hours, crackled alive with static that rose and fell in a cadence too deliberate to be random. No voice emerged, only hiss, and a faint rhythmic click like fingernails on glass. Mark reached to kill the power, yet the dial spun of its own accord, the display flickering between frequencies no station claimed. He yanked the fuse from the panel. The static died, but a sour metallic taste coated his tongue as though the sound had flooded the air itself. Around mile 7, the engine coughed, backfired, and lost power. The truck coasted to a stop beneath an archway of skeletal maples, whose branches intertwined so tightly that headlights failed to touch the sky beyond. In that sudden stillness, the forest revealed its true vacancy. No insects, no night birds, just the hush of damp leaves collapsing under their own decay. Mark stepped out to pop the hood, and the smell hit him, sweet, chemical, and faintly charred, as if antifreeze had boiled dry on a distant fire that no longer burned. Steam drifted from the radiator like breath from a concealed mouth. He scanned the trees for a break in the canopy, and noticed a pale rectangle deeper in the woods. An old service station sign mounted on a leaning post, its fluorescent tubes dead, yet glowing faintly from within, pulsing as though an unseen heartbeat powered them. The ground between him and that ghost light sloped downward, etched by 2 parallel ruts that vanished into brush. Fresh oil flecked the mud inside the ruts, glistening despite the darkness, and boot prints overlapped the tracks, small, bare, and staggered, as if someone had been dragged or someone had danced. Mark's breath clouded in front of him, though the dashboard thermometer insisted it was 53 degrees. Wind found its voice at last, carrying with it the low moan of distant machinery, or perhaps a choir buried beneath the soil. Without warning, the truck's headlights dimmed to embers, then flared back so bright they bleached the world white. In that strobing glare he saw the maples bend toward the road, trunks flexing as if the trees strained on invisible tendons, and for an instant the forest floor writhed, leaves folding back to reveal a quilt of bones bleached to milk glass. The lights died completely. Darkness surged in like water through a broken hull. Behind him, the truck's passenger door slammed, though he had left it locked. When he whipped around, the cab sat open, empty, but the interior dome light glowed blood red, illuminating a single object on the cracked vinyl bench. A child's canvas sneaker, damp with fresh mud, its laces tied in a perfect knot. Panic struck, a physical blow beneath the ribs, and Mark scrambled into the driver's seat, stabbing the key. The engine turned over sluggishly, then roared as if startled awake. Headlights reignited. The sneaker was gone. Gravel spat from spinning tires while the truck lurched forward, yet the odometer froze on the same decimal even as the speedometer climbed. The road ahead uncoiled into darkness, but the mile marker he had passed minutes earlier stood again in the beams. Letters blistered, number unchanged. The forest swallowed the tailpipe's protest, and Mark realized the night itself had begun to circle, a predator tightening its path around prey that had only just started to run. Chapter 2. Trail of Light on Rotten Earth. Mark pushed the Dodge until the engine sputtered again, then coasted to the shoulder where the asphalt bled into swampy peat. The night pressed against the cab like wet cloth, smothering every thought except the need for traction, for signal, for any promise of human geometry in this formless dark. When the truck finally wheezed to silence, he stepped out and felt the world sag beneath his boots. The ground had the give of soaked carpet, saturated with something thicker than rainwater. A sickle-sliver moon slipped behind clouds, yet a weak glow lurked under the trees ahead, a bruised amber radiance trembling just above ground level, as though the earth itself were remembering fire. He raised his flashlight, but the beam drowned in vapor, revealing only motes drifting like ash. Closer, the glow resolved into a line of objects, 10, maybe 12, small glass jars set at uneven intervals along a sunken path. Each jar contained a stub of tallow candle no wider than a thumb, flame guttering but unquenched in the windless air. The jars were half buried in sludge, lids rusted away, wax pooling over labels that had once shown a cartoon Easter rabbit. Lit by those feeble candles, the mud looked carnivorous, ridged with bubbles that expanded and burst in silence, releasing threads of pale steam that curled around Mark's ankles. Just beyond the first jar lay 3 overlapping footprints, naked and child-sized, pressed so deeply the toes filled with brackish water. He crouched, expecting cold, yet heat rose from the impressions as if life still pulsed under the muck. Between the prints was a toy sheriff's badge, plastic silver encrusted with wet loam, its pin bent backward as though ripped free in struggle. He touched the badge and yanked his hand away. The plastic pulsed under his fingers with the spasmodic rhythm of a dying sparrow's heart. He pocketed the badge without understanding why, feeling it buzz faintly against his thigh like a phone receiving texts from the grave. Wind shifted and carried a cloying smell that jolted memory. County Fair cotton candy left too long in the sun, chemical pink, rotting sweet. The odor rode waves of warmer air drifting from somewhere deeper down the candle path. He followed, sure each step would suck him ankle deep, yet the mud solidified underfoot exactly where he placed his weight, like invisible boards slid into position just in time. The jars brightened in sympathy, flames lengthening, glass sweating crimson droplets that slid and hissed when they struck the ground. Halfway along the trail he found a Polaroid photograph nailed to a cedar trunk with a roofing tack. The image showed this same stretch of road under daylight, truck absent, candles unlit, and in the center stood a blurred human silhouette holding something small and sagging, an impossible preview of Mark's own posture now. The date, scrawled on the white frame, read, October 12th, 1994, the day the underground seam fire had finally suffocated the remaining miners in Marrow's Gap. His father had fought that fire. His father had never wanted Mark near these hills. The cedar's sap bled black in the candlelight, dripping onto the photograph and smearing the year until only 19 remained. A branch above groaned, and something heavy slid across the bark. Too slow for an animal, too deliberate for wind. He tilted the flashlight upward and caught a glimpse of flannel fabric snagged on a limb, soaked so thoroughly it glistened like raw liver. Rope marks ridged the flannel as though someone had been cinched there and left for the crows. The jars behind him blinked out in rapid succession, their extinguished smoke issuing tiny squeals like tea kettles. Darkness sprinted to catch up. He turned back toward the truck, but the candles ahead flared brighter, a corridor of intent ushering him forward. The path dipped and revealed a drainage culvert clogged with brush and crushed soda cans, yet inside, the light glimmered strongest, pooling like molten gold. Mud along the rim bore fresh handprints, adult-sized, the fingers raked until nails had torn free and embedded like black beetles in the clay. For one heartbeat he considered retreat, but the badge in his pocket throbbed so violently his thigh muscles twitched. The culvert exhaled a moist heat salted with ozone, and somewhere within, metal rasped against stone in a rhythm that matched the badge's pulse. He stooped, lifted a jar for courage, and the candle guttered almost out, then surged, splashing wax over his wrist. The heat branded him with a shape eerily similar to the sheriff's star. Inside the culvert, a pinpoint of electric blue light peeled itself from the darkness and began drifting toward him, swift as a dragonfly, silent as frost. The earth under his boots shuddered like something waking up hungry, and the forest behind closed its ranks, erasing every sign that a truck, a road, or an escape route had ever existed. Chapter 3. Black Carousel of Whispers. The blue mote drifted from the culvert, pausing before Mark like an inquisitive insect, then veered into the trees. He followed, jar in hand, each step sinking deeper into mulch that squelched with the consistency of pulped organs. The badge against his thigh throbbed in counterpoint to his racing pulse. Overhead the canopy compressed until only a sliver of sky showed, thin and pallid as an old scar. The mote brightened and multiplied, splitting into a swarm of cold sparks that threaded between trunks, sketching a route that could have been path or lure. Almost immediately the forest began to speak. The first murmur came from below, a tremor of syllables vibrating through the soil and climbing his shins like static. Then a second voice joined from somewhere behind his left ear, higher, brittle, carrying the cadence of a child practicing a hymn backward. More joined, layering into a susurrus too dense to parse. Fragments of names, half-remembered warnings, numbers that advanced and rewound. No single whisper was louder than a breath, yet together they formed a tide that pressed against his eardrums until his vision pulsed gray. He tried to outrun the tide, but every dart between trees brought him into thicker coils of sound. Saplings leaned across his shoulders like spectators closing ranks around a spectacle. Bark exuded tarry rivulets that stank of creosote and hot copper. Where droplets struck his jacket, they sizzled neat holes through the canvas, releasing little snakes of steam. He tore free a sleeve to stop the spread, and the ruined cloth fluttered upward as if gravity had misplaced it, spiraling out of sight into branches that no longer looked wholly botanical. The blue sparks converged at a clearing, precisely circular and too symmetrical to be natural. At its rim, 13 railroad lanterns hung from meat hooks driven into the surrounding pines. Their lenses glowed black, not merely dark, but absorbing light from candle and sky alike, creating voids that pulsed in time with the whispers. Within the circle the ground was bare, yet impressions of feet, hundreds, maybe thousands, pocked the soil, each depressingly fresh. Mud in the footprints shivered, as though something beneath tried to inhale through them. Mark stepped across the threshold and the voices fell silent in a single exhalation, leaving the hush of a church after electricity dies. The badge ceased throbbing. The jar in his hand guttered out. In that instant, the only illumination came from the fat amber moon that had risen unseen and now hovered directly overhead, bloated twice its natural size, its edges distorted as though viewed through cracked glass. Shadows of the lantern hooks stretched inward, meeting at the center like spokes of a wheel. A low, mechanical clack sounded from beneath the ground. Soil split along the spoke lines and receded, revealing a mosaic of miners' helmets half-buried crown-up. Lamps still attached, yet shining inward toward a central cavity. Inside that hollow lay a reel-to-reel tape recorder, spools turning though no tape threaded between them. The recorder clicked with each rotation, and with every click the helmets flashed, casting strobed silhouettes onto the surrounding trunks. Those silhouettes formed figures of different heights standing shoulder to shoulder, their heads bowed, hands linked, as if a congregation rehearsing a dance macabre. With the seventh click, the tape recorder coughed up a cloud of coal dust that carried the stench of scorched diesel. The dust did not disperse but flattened into ribbons that wrapped around Mark's ankles, climbing with intimate purpose. Faint vibrations traveled through the ribbons. The whispers had returned, but spoke now from inside his marrow, reciting mining inspection reports, shifts his father had worked, casualty statistics, and between the data points a single refrain naming Mark as the unpaid debt. He lurched backward, but the soil beyond the lantern line rose like a tidal wall, soft yet unyielding. Lantern hooks twisted downward, tips sharpening into talons that angled toward his throat. From the hollow, the recorder drum accelerated, and each lantern emitted a reverse glow, sucking color and warmth from the air. Frost spidered across his eyelashes. Breath crystallized and fell as black snow. He saw his reflection in the nearest void lens, eyes wide, mouth open. Then the reflection liquefied into the face of a young boy wearing a melted sheriff's badge, cheeks streaked with soot, lips forming a silent accusation. Before the talons touched skin, the earth shuddered in a spasm that toppled the lanterns and slammed the soil plates shut. A wind howled outward, flinging Mark off his feet and through a gap in the pines that had not existed a heartbeat earlier. He landed on a gravel road still warm from buried fire, the jar shattered beside him, wax sizzling into stone. Behind, the clearing was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of trees that whispered nothing, as though the forest had already swallowed its evidence and now tasted the lingering salt of his terror. Chapter 4. The One Who Collected Debts. Mark staggered down the gravel grade, lungs sawing at air that smelled of burnt plastic and cold iron. Moonlight wavered behind racing clouds, illuminating the road just long enough for him to see that it ended in a narrow bridge spanning a dry ravine. The hand railing had collapsed in places, leaving jagged stanchions that jutted like broken ribs. Beyond the bridge rose a ridge of shale, streaked with sulfur yellow where the underground fires still outgassed in weak, fetid plumes. Between ridgeline and bridge waited the tollkeeper. He stood motionless in the center of the span, wrapped in a hooded coat sewn from mismatched canvas patches. Feed sacks, miners' aprons, scraps of children's rain slickers. Each scrap bore a stitched name, hundreds of them, black thread glinting wetly as though always freshly inked. The hood hung forward, masking the face, but a faint crimson glow pulsed from within, brightening in slow heartbeats. Mark felt every pulse echo in the raw burn on his wrist where wax had branded him. Wind hissed through the fractured railing, yet no breeze stirred the coat. Instead, it lifted in tiny increments on unseen currents, revealing boots fashioned from fused doll parts, plastic feet melted to leather soles, toes curled in silent shrieks. With a deliberate lift of one arm, the toll-keeper produced a ledger bound in strip-mined lead. Pages turned, though no fingers touched them, and each page flashed Mark's full name, birth date, even the scar pattern on his kneecap from a bike wreck at 10. The ink bled like fresh oil across old columns headed balance due. Mark wanted to flee into the trees, but the forest had gone silent again, trunks leaning inward like prison bars. The air felt thick with slow thoughts, as if the land itself weighed his options. He stepped onto the bridge. The planks underfoot groaned and sagged, yet did not break. As he advanced, waterless depth below revealed pale things half buried in silt. Hard hats, lunch pails, entire lockers gnawed by rust, relics from miners swallowed decades ago. When he reached the midpoint, the toll-keeper snapped the ledger shut. The sound echoed like a vault door sealing infinity. From inside the hood came a hush no louder than lint hitting carpet, but Mark's ears filled with it until equilibrium faltered. Vision warped. The ravine swelled outward, showing tunnels beneath the shale lined with makeshift shrines, lunchboxes filled with teeth, Polaroids pinned to ribs, tiny shoes stacked like cordwood. Each relic glimmered radioactive blue, then extinguished, leaving retinal ghosts. The hush became words spoken in many mouths at once, syllables mined from 3 generations of widows whose letters had never been answered. They accused, pleaded, applauded, then merged into a single command. Pay what was promised. Mark's pockets seemed to move on their own. The plastic sheriff's badge leapt out, landing on the ledger with a clack that shook the bridge. The crimson glow inside the hood brightened to a furnace white, casting long shadows that jittered and buckled like marionettes cut from their strings. The stitched names on the coat writhed, letters reordering to form new words, some spelled backward, some in languages Mark did not know, but one line stayed constant. Taylor, Owen, 1994. His father's entry, balance, 1 life. Mark understood then that the badge was collateral, delivered by a child who never left the mine fires. He also understood that collateral alone would not satisfy the ledger. The toll-keeper extended an arm. Sleeve cuffs unraveled into tendrils that coiled toward Mark's heart. He backed away, but another tendril slipped through the floorboards and lashed his ankle, ice cold and strong as cable. The bridge flexed, dropping several inches, making every loose bolt sing. A surge of ancestral panic propelled him to bellow his father's name into the gorge, a raw sound torn by guilt and defiance. Echoes struck the shale walls, and with each rebound the ledger's cover buckled inward as though struck by invisible fists. Black ash spewed from between pages, swirling into a miniature cyclone that howled with voices of men Mark had never met yet somehow recognized by timbre. His lineage of debtors roaring dissent. The tendril snapped. The toll-keeper staggered and cracks spread through the patchwork coat, seams popping, names tearing free as paper cuttings. Mark seized a broken stanchion, swung it like a battering ram, and drove the jagged end through the ledger. Lead shattered. Molten glyphs spattered onto the planks, burning holes that seeped red light. The toll-keeper convulsed, hood yawning wide enough for Mark to glimpse a cavity filled not with flesh, but with spinning tokens. Dog tags, wedding rings, umbilical clamps, items traded for one more day above ground. The bridge began to collapse, deck panels sloughing into darkness. Mark sprinted, boards giving way beneath his heels, ash wind clawing at his back. He leapt for solid ground as the final span disintegrated, rolling onto dirt just as the ledger, the toll-keeper, and the stitched coat vanished into the ravine. Only a lingering glow remained, pulsing from the shattered severance between worlds, and with each pulse a single word formed in the dust before fading. Ode. Chapter 5. The Road That Wasn't. Mark climbed the shale ridge, lungs burning from sulfur and grit, and found himself staring at a straight, two-lane highway that should not have existed. Its center line glowed faintly, as if the paint contained slow embers, and the asphalt looked newly poured, unscarred by weather or time. Yet no map had ever shown a road running north from the ruins of Marrow's Gap toward the Allegheny front. Beyond the first quarter mile, everything vanished into a haze like heat mirage, but the air lay knife-cold against his skin. Logic screamed turn back, but the terrain behind still shook with subterranean thunder, and every instinct insisted forward was the only remaining vector of escape. The moment his boots touched the pavement, the hush of a vast audience settled, as though invisible bleachers flanked the shoulder. The badge wound in his pocket ceased its ghostly throb. In its place, his ribs vibrated to a tempo that matched streetlights ahead, bulbs flickering on one by one, each casting a sickly green cone over the lane. He advanced, passing mile marker 0 carved not into metal, but into the chest of a wooden mannequin planted at the roadside. Its face wore no features, only a single O drilled where a mouth should be, and from that hole seeped cigarette smoke, though no cigarette burned. As Mark moved deeper, the fog thickened into matte walls, isolating him in a tunnel of toxic light. Asphalt underfoot grew tacky, as if not fully set, and slow bubbles formed, burst, and released whispers too faint to parse. He accelerated, but the scenery refused proper motion. The mannequins multiplied, each impaled by a mile marker carved sequentially higher, their torsos glossy with sap that smelled like embalming fluid. Marker 7 stood at a crossroads that existed only in negative, a perpendicular strip of darker black, striped with ash instead of paint. When he glanced right, he saw his own silhouette already standing 50 yards down that spur, arm raised in warning. It vanished as quickly as the notion of turning. The next lamp revealed fresh roadkill sprawled across the center line, a white-tailed doe, belly split, organs steaming in frigid air. Its eyes reflected not light but footage of his father descending a mine shaft, the camcorder perspective jittering in Mark's childhood memory. Blink, eyes went dull, camcorder gone, but the gut pile wriggled, birthing crimson worms that spelled debts are inherited before melting into tar. He veered around the carcass, heart jackhammering, throat raw with the taste of coal smoke that no longer burned anywhere but inside his nerves. At mile marker 13, the road dipped, and he felt gravity relax its rules. Each footfall stretched seconds longer than possible, calves floating before slapping down. The shoulder dropped away to reveal a valley lined with televisions abandoned on iron poles. Every screen glowed blue and showed live images of him from impossible angles. Overhead drone shots, microscopic views of pores leaking fear sweat, thermal silhouettes pulsing in red. Static howled from shattered speakers, forming words in Morse Mark never formally learned but instinctively understood. Ledger open, credit denied, collection escalated. Sudden vibration rattled his molars. Far behind, the mannequins toppled in unison like dominoes. A wave ran through the pavement, rolling toward him, buckling the surface into black tentacles that clawed his boots. He sprinted, but the lane elongated, each stride covering less ground than the one before, as though distance itself had been mortgaged, and now accrued interest he could not pay. Ahead, a lone streetlight winked out, leaving a void that spread like spilled ink. In that darkness a shape coalesced, taller than any human, draped in shredded hazard tape, its head a cage of rebar filled with rattling miners' tags. It stepped onto the line, dragging a cleaver forged from two welded pickaxes, sparks shearing off the edge and freezing midair, suspended like tiny stop signs. Mark turned to flee the way he came, but the road had folded, forming a cul-de-sac of fog that reflected his panic back at him in greenish hues. The badge in his pocket reignited, branding his thigh through denim, yet this time the star shape bloomed outward, scorching cloth into an 8-pointed debt sigil that hissed, paid in full. Heat lanced up his side. He screamed, stumbled, and landed within the void beneath the extinguished lamp. No ground cushioned the fall, only weightless descent, silence compressing lungs until they prickled with frost. Above, the rebar cage leaned over the hole's rim, tags chiming funeral bells, and the cleaver swung down once, severing the streetlight's final filament. The world snapped off like a bad bulb, and Mark dropped into a darkness where roads, debts, and heartbeat were all negotiable, but none guaranteed. Chapter 6. Scars in the Fog. Mark landed on something that felt at once liquid and solid, like gelatin mixed with gravel. The impact rolled him onto his back, and above him the sky looked ruptured, a gauze of gray stitched with pulsing red capillaries. The world smelled of wet matches and singed wool. He rose unsteadily, discovering that the badge-shaped burn on his thigh had blistered into raised runes, tracing a spiral toward his groin, each welt hot enough to steam in the raw air. Around him stretched a plain of ground-level fog, dense as poured concrete, yet constantly reshaping. Every curl suggesting a doorway that vanished before the eye fully registered it. There was no sign of the road, the bridge, or the toll-keeper. Instead, half-submerged silhouettes littered the mist. Fence posts, mailbox poles, street signs, all leaning at odd angles, tips eaten away by unseen corrosion. He recognized the bent aluminum of a West Virginia highway marker bearing the digits of his childhood exit off I-79, though here it pointed straight into nowhere. As he walked, the fog parted in narrow gullies that guided him like trenches, revealing asphalt fragments embedded in the earth, as though the land had chewed up pavement and was slowly digesting it. Every so often the mist thinned enough to show something lying ahead, and each revelation carved a fresh gouge through his nerves. First came a water-stained yearbook photo, laminated and nailed to a driftwood plank, displaying his own 7th-grade portrait beside an obituary date 2 years in the future. Farther on he found a rusted stoplight suspended from nothing, lenses pulsing yellow in a heart attack rhythm that slowed his pulse every time it blinked. Next appeared a newspaper vending box, glass shattered, front page announcing a mine cave-in with an empty space where casualty numbers should have been printed. The blank line bled ink that wormed across the article, rewriting facts into debts owed. The runes on his thigh cramped each time he touched one of these relics, tightening like a tourniquet around bone. He pressed on, driven by equal measures of terror and the instinct that movement itself was currency now, motion buying seconds of existence. Gusts rose, swirling the fog into towering pillars that marched parallel to his path. Inside those pillars, silhouettes of miners' helmets rotated like moons around invisible planets, their lamps flickering in sync with his nerve endings. Filaments cast thin beams that cut through him without warmth, photographing every tremor of guilt and projecting it back onto the vapor walls. Without warning, the plane sloped upward, and the fog receded to reveal a cul-de-sac of tarmac, flawless as obsidian. In its center lay his Dodge pickup, engine idling though the exhaust drifted upward, forming a tornado that never dispersed. The sight should have kindled relief, yet dread pooled in his gut. The truck's windows were white with condensation on the inside, and smeared across the windshield in a child's handwriting were the words, "Bring us home." He sensed movement in the cab, small shapes scurrying, tapping the glass with fingernails too many to count. He approached, but the runes flared, arresting him mid-stride. Beneath the truck, the asphalt rippled like the surface of a pond, and a network of cracks shot outward, spelling an expanding asterisk beneath his boots. Through those fractures, he glimpsed a glowing mine shaft far below, where skeletal elevator cages yo-yoed without cables, transporting figures made of soot who stared upward with empty, hopeful sockets. The fissures widened, hungry to enlarge the gap. Mark turned to run, yet every direction now presented the same cul-de-sac, truck-centered, message smeared. The landscape had looped, copying and pasting reality into an inescapable pattern. Fog walls thundered closer, and faces formed within them. His father's, his mother's, the blank mannequins, all mouthing the same single syllable. Pay. The asphalt beneath him liquefied, seeping into the burn on his thigh, and he realized the spiral runes were not wounds, but threads, drawing the debt directly into muscle and marrow. He made one last dash toward the truck, plunging through the molten surface. The cab door yawned open as if expecting him, but the interior stretched away like an infinite hallway lined with locker doors that banged in a wind he could not feel. Each locker bore a brass plate etched with debts settled and debts accruing, the numbers multiplying faster than seconds passed. A roar grew behind, the sound of collapsing timbers under miles of rock, and the hallway tilted downward, accelerating him toward a pinpoint of darkness that consumed the light of the locker bulbs one by one. As the final bulb winked out, the spiral tightened into a single radiant node at the center of his being, then snapped. Silence rushed in like vacuum. The world became fog again, but this fog retained the shape of scars, white ridges across a blind face, waiting, perhaps, for the next debtor to trace its contours. Nothing remained of Mark but the faint scent of burned wax, and a child's muddy sneaker resting neatly where the Dodge had idled, its laces tied in a perfect knot.